Okay, so first tip is to go into preferences. So edit preferences. Go down to system and your undo steps. Blender defaults to 32. It seems like a lot, but it's not. And if you have a decent computer, you should max it to 256 because it will save you sometimes for sure. Okay, next tip. I don't know if you've ever had issues navigating in Blender, but by default, it sort of navigates around the center of the screen, which isn't necessarily the most useful thing ever. And if you've ever been modeling and bumped into issues where, like, let's say you have a mesh and it's pulled out like really far, something like that, and the center of your screen's here, it can be really hard to like get into what you're trying to look at. And it's not the most intuitive way to navigate. So the way to fix that is to go to Edit, Preferences, Navigation, and click Orbit Around Selection and save your preferences. This will orbit around whatever it is you have selected. So we have these 4 vertices selected. We're going to orbit around those 4 vertices. If I select this vertice over here, now we're orbiting around that. It generally makes it a lot easier to model in. So I usually keep that on. Okay, next tip is not going to be relevant for super long because I believe Blender is actually finally going to make this a default behavior, but it's basically setting up a normals overlay that is useful. So normals are basically the direction that each vertex or face or whatever is pointing. So like if I scale, like inset and extrude and scale along normals, it's going to scale along the direction that the face is pointing. Now, usually Blender by default does not show you the like front facing or back facing normals. It's easy to get flip normals though. Like if I take this object and scale it way down and scale it back up, the object looks fine, but it actually now has flip normals. So if I go into my overlays here and you see face orientation and I click that, oh, I lied. There we go. Okay, so if I apply a transform, now the normals are flipped. So you won't be able to tell this by default. And it can cause issues with lots of stuff, like if a Boolean won't work. I don't know. I'm not going to give a bunch of examples, but it causes problems if you don't know that the normals are flipped. And by default, like, so if I go here and recalculate the normals, it shows this intense blue for front-facing normals, which is not something you ever really need to see. The normals in and of themselves, like if they're good, you don't need to know it, but if they're bad, you need to know it. So the thing to do is to go into Preferences, go to Themes, go to 3D Viewport, and then scroll down to Face Orientation Front. And here you'll see the color that it has selected. And what I do is I set the alpha all the way off. And then I actually usually set this a little bit lower because it can get a little intense. You only need a little bit. But if you save preferences like that, now you can constantly keep this face orientation on. And the only time you'll know if there's an issue is if I flip the normals and they're not the way I want them to be. And if I go back and I recalculate, they're back to normal. So super useful thing. Again, they're going to be fixing that relatively soon, like I think in 4.4, but it's pretty useful to have without having to constantly check or have all that guesswork about which way your normals are facing. Okay, so the next tip is actually also in the interface settings, but if you look here, you'll notice that my edges are like very thin. The vertexes are super tiny. They can be kind of hard to click and see. And my interface is actually at a 1.25 scale right now. So if it was at default, it'd be slightly smaller. So if I go into the preferences, we're going to go to themes again, same one, 3D viewport. And this is more of a personal preference thing, but for me, I kind of can't live without doing this. So I set my vertexes a little bit larger. You can do 6, I'll probably do 5. And I also like to set my edge width to 2. It just makes it a lot easier to select things and work with a mesh when you're doing stuff in Blender, I find personally. So yeah. The next tip is also personal preference, but if you notice, if I try to press X and delete an object here, it gives me a confirmation window. I personally find it annoying. Like if I have a lot of stuff in a scene, it sucks to have to do 2 clicks to delete something every time. If you would like to have it so that it just deletes the object, you can go into Edit, Preferences, go to Key Map and search object.delete. And if you see this little drop down here that says confirm, you can uncheck that, save your preferences, and now it just deletes it, and you can just undo it with your extra undo steps. Okay, the next tip is the quick actions menu. It's something that I didn't use for a long time, but it's super useful and I couldn't live without them now. So let's see here. We have our object. Something I used to do a lot would be right clicking and then set origin, origin to geometry, which moves the origin to a different location right about here. One thing you can do is actually just right click and add to quick favorites. I frequently do the 3D cursor one. I also do snapping. So like selection to cursor, cursor to selected, and cursor to world origin in object mode. So now if I click this and I hit Q, I have all these options. So I can do cursor to selected and it'll go here. Cursor to world origin. It's a good way to sort of like manipulate the position of your objects in the scene without having to click through a bunch of menus. It's also context sensitive. So in edit mode, if I press Q, you'll see I don't have any. And if you use certain things that are buried behind menus a lot, it can be very useful to add them to the quick favorites. Like, let's see here. A good one I use a lot is like smoothing vertices. That one doesn't have like a native keybind, so I add that to my quick favorites. You can add all sorts of stuff like checker deselect. I actually don't add that one, but it's kind of fun. You can add literally anything you want, and then now you can quickly sort of, have access to all those options without needing to waste time going through menus. Okay, so the next tip is toggling selectable. So I've added a couple random reference images, monkey space station here. I've also added a big area light over the mesh. And all these objects can be a real pain when you're trying to work. If you accidentally click your reference image or accidentally click the area light, it just gets annoying with a, dense scene after a while. So I don't know why this isn't default, but if you go to this little pin sort of drop down menu and you click this sort of arrow here, now all of your like items in your outliner have a selectable toggle. So all these reference images, you can keep them in the scene and toggle their selectability. Same thing for the lights. And now you're not going to accidentally click anything but the stuff you want to be able to click, like your object, this beautiful cube. The next tip is about saving your startup file. Basically, everyone has their own preferences for stuff that they like to have in their project file, and it gets very tedious setting up things differently from the default over and over again, and you can fix that by doing a startup file. So, let's say you don't want a default cube, you just want to start with a empty scene. Let's say there are render settings you want, like starting in cycles with GPU compute. For example, that normals overlay. And, if you have like a matte cap you want to use or something like that, you can set up every little window the exact way you want it, and then go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File. And then when you close and reopen Blender, it will open up the way you left it or the way you saved it. That also works for these other default options too. So like video editing, for example, if you open a new video editing thing, you can set it up with the encoding options that you constantly use, and end up with exactly what you want every single time. And then you can save default video editing startup file. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm in my main actual Blender install in 4.2. I was using 4.1 because I just wanted an easy way to show a clean install. The next step is about copying attributes to multiple objects and linking things like materials and modifiers. So we have Suzanne here. I'm going to put a level 1 subdivision on Suzanne, and I'm going to duplicate her a bunch of times and show you this. So I have all these Suzannes here, and say I go into my modifiers, and I actually, after doing this, realize that it's rendering at 2, but I only want it to render at a level 1 subdivision. You might think that you have to click every single Suzanne and change that option, but you definitely do not have to do that. If you select them all, you notice the different color outlines. This is the active object. So what you can do is, right here is my active object. If you change this one to 1, right click and go to copy to selected, every single Suzanne will now have 1. Same thing with materials. I'll show you like linked data real quick. Let's say I have UV sphere. I'm going to do the same thing super quick. Sorry. Let's say I have these 4 spheres and I want them all to have this amazing material that I put onto it. What you can do is select these and then shift click, select the active object. And if you hit Control L, you can link materials and copy multiple materials onto the same objects that you want. Same thing works with a lot of different things in Blender. So let's say I select all these and I click again and I hit Control L, you'll see that there's copy modifiers, and now they all have that level 1 subdivision on them. It will save you a ton of time, and if you don't know about that, you're gonna have to do it manually. The next tip is basically about add-ons and extensions, which I guess is semi-controversial, but it shouldn't be. Blender is a free program, and the nature of open source software means that there are often third parties and stuff that add functionality that make the program work a lot better that aren't technically officially supported. So in 4.2 on, Blender has the extension system. So if you open your preferences, you'll see get extensions. I believe you'll have to enable Blender accessing the internet from this menu the first time you do it, but I recommend doing it. I'm not going to tell you to download or waste a bunch of time on extensions and add-ons, but there are a couple, 3 actually in particular, that I would recommend basically everyone just have. The first one is Loop Tools. It's an extension on the marketplace that you should be able to download from this menu. The next one is F2. And then the third one, I believe, is actually still technically an add-on, and it's called Node Wrangler. These are just 3 that add functionality that should, quite frankly, be default in Blender and isn't. And I would highly recommend everyone, regardless of how new you are, install and enables those 3 in particular, and I'll sort of show you what they do right now. I'm redoing this because I realized I didn't have screencast keys on before, so let me show you F2, and then I will show you Loop Tools, and then Node Wrangler super quick. So F2 is basically a smart filling add-on. It's like amazing. So if I delete these really quick, you'll see all these faces here. I can select an edge, hold my cursor to the side I want to fill to, and if I just press F a bunch, it will fill it in. Saves a ton of time, super useful. It can also do more advanced stuff. Like if I click this corner and I just press F and then right click, I can fill in areas that would otherwise be very painful to fill manually. It would be very convoluted to fill along this plane without some sort of like bordering geometry. And then you can just click this and F, and you can fill things much faster. Very useful for modeling. Next one is going to be Loop Tools. One of the more common questions I see from like new people to Blender modeling is, how do you like cut a circle in a face? You often hear people say Booleans, but I would say that more often than not, the better way would to be actually to model them, and Loop Tools gives you a tool that you can do that with. So if I inset here, it does require 8 points to make a proper circle, but if I do inset here and I have this face, I can hit Loop Tools. I have this pinned, which is another interface tip, but basically if you right click and go to Loop Tools, circle, bam, it actually models a circle, and you can cut a hole. I'm going to inset really quick just for fun. And then if I put a sub D modifier on here, you see it actually creates a nice circle with good topology. Things like flattening are very useful in loop tools. So if I pull this out and then I select all these, it'll flatten it. Sometimes not exactly the way you want with exactly what I just selected, but it is a useful tool. The curve tool is amazing. If I pull these up, I'm going to turn off this subdivision surface modifier real quick. If I pull these up, like a couple vertexes along my loop, if I select these, it will curve the unselected points and interpolate curvature along that loop. Kind of confusing, but if I hit curve, you'll see it actually generates a curve. I'm going to click boundaries. I won't go into too much about how to use every single tool. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory, but they are incredibly useful features to have when modeling in Blender. The next one is going to be Node Wrangler, and I'm not going to go too in depth into Node Wrangler, but I'm going to show you some of the most useful ways to use it. So let's see here. I'm going to add a mesh. Let's do a Suzanne. If I add a material here, let's say I want to add an image texture to this object. I'm going to go into look dev real quick. Here I can select the principled BSDF and hit Control T, and it will add an image texture to a mapping node with UV coordinates, which is a very repetitive task to do manually. And you can just open up a shader or a texture and it'll map it right there. Even better, it will do PBR texture sets. Probably should have prepared one. Maybe I have one in my downloads, but basically if you hit Control Shift T, but bam, okay, sweet. So you can hit all the different maps that you want to use and then do the whole setup, and it'll map a whole texture setup more or less properly and even group it and show you all the stuff.